Hello, everyone. Welcome. So lovely to be with everyone this morning. Thank you for joining us. My name is Natasha Pereira. I'm the manager of Visitor Experience. I know I've met many of you, and many of you have met me. So I can't see you, but but welcome and thank you for joining us. So I've had the great pleasure of being a listener and a fan of our speaker today. So I know that we're in for a great treat. And I would like to just take this opportunity to thank our members for their continued support, particularly this last year. We certainly can't do it without you, and we're so glad to have this program for you this morning. So I will pass it over to Leland, who will introduce our speaker today.
Great. Thank you so much, Natasha. And I reiterate what Natasha said. Thank you so much to our members for your support, especially during this crazy time. It's very much appreciated. And I'm so excited for our speaker today, and I'm going to introduce her right now. Jennifer Dasal is joining us in art history from UC Davis and her MA in art history from Notre Dame. She's currently the curator of modern and contemporary art at the North Carolina Museum of Art. And in 2016, Jennifer created and continues to host the internationally popular podcast, ArtCurious. ArtCurious was chosen as one of PC Magazine's best podcasts of the year for 3 years in a row. And it was selected as one of the best history podcasts. Last September, Jennifer's first book, ArtCurious, Stories of the Unexpected, Slightly Odd, and Strangely Wonderful in Art History, was published and has already received a much coveted starred review from Publisher Weekly and highlighted in various publications. And before we get started, I just want to say the New York Museum of Art thanks the New Jersey Council for the Humanities for their support of this program. And we also thank Jennifer for joining us today. So Jennifer, I'll pass it on to you. And just to let you know, we'll be taking questions at the very end. So if you want to put your questions in the chat, we will get to those once Jennifer wraps up. All right, so Jennifer, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I want to thank the whole team at the New York Museum of Art, and thank you to Natasha and Leland so much for being here to help me out and facilitate today, and for inviting me to be a part of this. This has been so much fun. So as hopefully some of you know, and as Leland and Natasha both mentioned, I am Jennifer Dasal, and I am the host and creator of the ArtCurious podcast, which is a free audio show that explores what I like to call the unexpected, slightly odd, and the strangely wonderful in art history. And of course, just as Leland also mentioned, I just published my first book last year in September, which is, of course, ArtCurious, Stories of Unexpected, Slightly Odd, and Strangely Wonderful in Art History. I'll give you a little bit more on the book a little bit later, of course. But essentially what I like to say to people is that I live, eat, and breathe art, and really made it my life to be surrounded by it at practically every turn. But how I got here, this point in my life, where it's actually very strangely wonderful in and of itself. And because if you had asked me when I was growing up, that I would into both my vocation and my action talking about art, living in this world of art, I would have told you that you're dreaming, that you were not. And that is because I would have thought you had lost your marbles if you'd said that I would grow up to be an art historian, because I basically grew up thinking that art was very boring. And partially this feeling stemmed from the fact that I really was not exposed to the visual arts much as a child. I do remember that there was the occasional school field trip to my hometown museum, but it wasn't enough to make an impression. I don't have any really firm memories of any of those trips. And in the terms of actually making art physically myself, any joy or interest I had in doing this was foiled by what felt to me like an increasingly stern number of art teachers who would begin class by making art feel really like it was an absolute chore. And I always tell one particular story about my art education that has really stuck with me for nigh on 30 years now. And it was when I was in junior high, I had this teacher who was teaching us about how to make art, and she began every class the same way, which was with something she called the circle exercise. Now, I want to reiterate the fact that I am not an artist myself, nor am I an art teacher. So I can't ever say whether or not this method is a good way to begin an art class or really to teach much about making art in and of itself. But just so you know, the little exercise basically went like this. You had 5 minutes on the clock, and you were armed with only a pencil or a pen and paper. And if you were using a pencil, then you could use an eraser to make as many changes as you want. But in those 5 minutes, you needed to be sure to make as close to a perfect circle on paper as possible. Freehand, no compass, no other tools or implements of any type. And the key word here was perfect. It needed to be a perfect circle. And then at the end of that 5 minutes, we were required to turn in this piece of paper with our name on it, and we were given a letter grade on it. So I don't know if there are any type A perfectionists out there like me, anyone, but if you were anything like me, then getting this circle done and finding myself foiled over and over again, just failing at creating what was deemed perfect, was really one of the first things that I felt like I couldn't crack, especially as somebody who really sought very well to be good at school and to get good grades. So I grew up thinking that this was what art was, something that I physically couldn't do, I couldn't crack. And the more I tried to practice getting to this perfection point, the more it didn't seem to help and it didn't matter. So to me, it felt like art was something inaccessible, something hard, and then at the best, something boring. It did not feel like anything that really meant anything to me at this point in my life. And unfortunately, as I got older, things didn't really improve all that much. I didn't go through high school having any interest or anything having to do with the arts, but things came to a very interesting breaking point right about the time that I was entering my freshman year in college. And so I was registering for everything that I required for my major, which I declared early, which was geology, by the way. I was very into science. So I was ready to go with geology classes, chemistry, calculus, just everything you really would need right off the bat for studying earth sciences. And I decided that I really needed to get an elective out of the way. And I really wanted to take one of those pesky humanities requirements at the top of my list there for graduation. And everything that I tried to get into was already maxed out with registration. I tried to get into great books, English courses, writing, music, everything. And they all were full. I could not break through. So after I attempted to register for probably about 5 or 6 classes, and I couldn't get in, I began to panic a little bit. So I made an appointment with a course counselor. And once I got to her office, she basically just brushed me off very calmly and said, "This is not a problem. It's going to be fine. We get this all the time. And let's just open the course catalog and see what we find that could be of interest to you." So I always kind of bridge this topic with younger people who are younger than me and say, I don't know if you ever had physical course catalogs that were like this thick. But this is what this course counselor did was she cracked open this giant book that had listings of every course available that year. And she started, of course, at the very beginning with the letter A. And almost immediately she stopped and she looked up at me and said, "Oh, art history. Lots of people take art history. Let's just see if this is something that would be of interest and available for you. They're extremely popular." And without me even opening my mouth, she basically jumped over to her computer and found out that, of course, there was space available in your Intro to Art History 101. And she registered me without even saying anything. And all of a sudden, I found myself as a freshman coming in to take my basic art history course that taught from the beginnings of ancient art to medieval times and the early Renaissance. Now, how did I feel about this? I was not happy. I was really not looking forward to this class because of my previous experiences thinking art was boring, inaccessible, or hard, just something that was not intriguing to me at all. But I always like to say that the eternal joke was really on me because a few weeks in, I found myself doing something very strange. So I am from California originally. I now live in North Carolina. But when I was in college, I was in California and I was doing the thing that a lot of us did in our dorms, which was we hung out at the pool. There was an actual dorm pool, which is crazy to me. And so while my friends were sitting around the pool, tanning and reading their romance novels or Stephen King and Dean Koontz paperbacks, I found myself doing something really weird, which is that I started bringing my art history textbook with me, as I am a total nerd. But as weird as that is, it was this first realization, this first moment that I realized that something had really changed for me, and that I stopped looking at art or these works of art as something dull or unnecessary, and that I had this incredible opportunity to see these works for the first time as these full, amazing stories of creation, of humanity, of inspiration, the urge to make that really draws us all in and makes us fully human. And I started becoming obsessed with art in a way that I could have never predicted. And 2 years later, I officially changed my major and I began studying art history in earnest at that point. The thing that I would eventually realize was that my original point of view that art wasn't stimulating or necessary, not really worthy of my time and attention, I discovered was not altogether uncommon. Because as I progressed through life, I seemed to be meeting with this similar reaction time after time as I introduced myself first as a student of art history, a graduate student, an art history gallery associate, a curatorial assistant, museum intern, and then finally, in the past decade and almost a decade and a half, as a curator at an art museum. Because it seems like the people I usually meet just in my daily travels seem to fall into these two camps with not a lot of people in the middle. There are the art lovers who proclaim their devotion to the visual arts, or the kind of person who says, I'm only visiting the museum today because my mom made me, or I heard the museum restaurant has the best burger in town and I'm only here just for that burger, things like that. So I very quickly learned that there was many who felt about art the same way that I once felt about art, that it was boring, that it wasn't cool the way the latest prestige TV show was cool, or it didn't move one to tears necessarily the same way that a particular strain of music did. It didn't celebrate the body the way that dance does, and that art, to many, is just a painting sitting on a wall or on the floor, as this work is here on your screen, or just a sculpture on a pedestal. This is a photograph, by the way, that's titled actually Boring Art, which I think is kind of beautiful and poignant on a few different levels. So I feel like my old assumptions about art were really haunting me for revenge at certain points. But it also made me feel very sad because I thought, what a shame it is to feel this way about art. And I thought that, if people were able to get into art a little bit more, perhaps by hearing some fun or even funny or strange stories behind a good work of art, maybe that would help. Maybe in some ways it would help to change their minds about art, even just a little bit, and that it might inspire them to find out a little bit more or to discover something that might mean something to them specifically on a more personal level. And so for me, I always say, what better way to get into something by telling me a little bit of a strange story, something a little different, unexpected, maybe even skewed towards the odd or the strange, less education and more entertainment at the offset. And that is when I originally came up with the idea to have the ArtCurious podcast. So, as I mentioned, my whole determination behind doing the podcast is that I wanted to show these stories that I call the unexpected, slightly odd, and strangely wonderful in art history. I developed and I premiered this show in the summer of 2016. So it's almost 5 years. It'll be 5 years this summer. And part of the reason that I initially really wanted to do a podcast right off the bat is that I feel very strongly that podcasts are such a democratic way to disseminate and enjoy stories. Because as long as you have a computer access or a smartphone, a device of some sort, they are almost always free to access podcasts. They're available all the time, and you can listen to them whenever and wherever you are. And at that point in 2016, there were still very few art history related podcasts out there. Art history, maybe there were only a handful. There were a lot of art podcasts that were about the process of art, about making art, but not a lot about the history aspect. And even though I am a modern and contemporary curator in my day job, I knew I didn't want to focus on contemporary art for my podcast because I really wanted to go back and reveal some of the fun things that I had learned about what I lovingly now call the old stuff, which is what I studied for a lot of my time as a graduate and undergraduate student. And plus, I myself am a big podcast listener because I basically consider it to be story time for grown-ups, and it's the backdrop to much of my daily life. And I thought, podcasting, that doesn't sound that hard. I think it won't be a whole lot of work. And so let's just give it a try. Turns out I was very wrong on that last part, but it has all worked out. Suffice to say that there is a very steep learning curve at the beginning, at least for someone like me. And then again, I can hardly believe it that here we are, again, almost 5 years later, and I'm still going strong with this really wonderfully engaged listenership and growing all the time. And in these past few years, I've done nearly 80 full length episodes, along with several other bonus deep dives of varying lengths, including some shorter content that I like to call little snackable bits. And I have covered a lot of content, all the way from the theory that was put forward by Patricia Cornwell, the novelist, that a British painter named Walter Sickert could have actually been Jack the Ripper. We've also uncovered the stunning and wonderfully successful career of one of my favorite artists, the official portraitist to Marie Antoinette, a woman named Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun. We've also talked about the super juicy rivalry between J.M.W. Turner and John Constable, and these landscape paintings that got everyone in 19th century England all riled up. And also have discussed some of the reasons why people might attack or destroy works of art. But there is one story that I've covered at the very beginning of the podcast that really holds a special place in my heart because it essentially started everything. The actual impetus behind ArtCurious started at a very specific moment, which was on a business trip. I was on a plane and I was flying to France to connect with an artist with whom I was just starting to begin a process of doing an exhibition with at the North Carolina Museum of Art. And he was working on a show in the south of France. And so I had the opportunity to fly over there to introduce myself in person and to get the ball rolling for planning the show. So before I got there, I had a couple days to kill in Paris, quelle horreur. And so I thought, I feel very lucky that I get to spend a couple of days tooling around and visiting art museums. And so the first thing I thought of was, here's an image of that artist. It's a South African artist named Wim Botha, whose work you see here. First thing I thought of was that I really wanted to go to the Louvre again. I had been to Paris maybe one other time at this point in my life. And I thought, you know what, it'll be really nice to go to the Louvre. I haven't been there in so long, and I would be really happy to see the Mona Lisa again. And at that moment that I thought of the Mona Lisa, I always think back to this very strange moment in that first Art History 101 class that I took when I was a freshman in college at the University of California, Davis. My professor was carrying us through talking about Leonardo da Vinci, and she starts talking about Mona Lisa and why this is an important work of art. And at the end of her conversation about this piece and why we study it today, she basically said, it'd be great if you ever get the chance to go to Paris, then you can go to the Louvre and you can see her in person. And then she paused for what felt like just a couple of seconds. And then she said, oh, but if you don't end up going there, it's not a big deal because the Mona Lisa they have on view at the Louvre is fake anyway. And I was floored. And then she moved on very quickly, like it wasn't a huge deal that she had just said this very weird thing that felt to me like the most bizarre conspiracy theory, or perhaps a total joke. But this professor seemed very serious. And she was someone whose opinion I very much respected, a professor who would end up going on in some ways to becoming one of my mentors. Very smart person, extremely level-headed, and somebody who really didn't seem like she would be putting forward any kind of conspiracy theory. And so that made it all the more disconcerting. And so I thought, is she being serious? And it turns out that she was. She certainly seemed to be at the very least. So it led me to wonder what about this most famous painting in the world would make an art historian like her so convinced in its falsehood. And it was a question that stumped me. I never really thought to ask about more of the details about her theory in person with her, but it was something that I could never forget just because it was so strange. So while I was on this business trip, and I did indeed go to see Mona Lisa, I thought, I'm going to look up more details about this work of art and what would possibly make my professor think of these strange things. So I started reading up on the incredible 1911 theft of the Mona Lisa. And the more that I read about this theft, I thought, oh my goodness, this is a really spectacular story. And by no means is this an unknown tale, but I knew personally that I didn't know much about it, and most people I knew didn't know all the juicy details of this crazy real life event. And as someone who likes podcasts, I thought, why not go ahead and make a podcast about this story? And how hard could that be? So, as I mentioned earlier, it turns out that it actually isn't the most straightforward thing to start doing a podcast, and certainly not a quick product to produce. But I definitely didn't consider that at the time. And I just basically jumped in wholeheartedly and officially started the podcast in mid 2016. And my first episode actually indeed ended up being this fascinating story about the theft or potential theft of the Mona Lisa as this first episode. So certainly when I began this podcast a few years ago, I could not have known that it would grow as large as it is. We are still very much a niche podcast and definitely an independent podcast, but I really didn't expect that it would get a lot of attention outside of my inner circle of friends and family. And at the offset, I was hoping that maybe 50 people would listen to it. And I was assuming that most of them would be related to me in some way. And it was really this incredibly low bar that I thought would be a marker of success. So it was really kind of mind blowing very quickly to know that it started to gain some interest. And I started being interviewed by multiple NPR stations, featured in magazines and newspapers. And I started getting recommended in places online by outlets such as Parade Magazine, the Boston Globe, Salon, Antiques and the Arts Weekly, and a lot more. And as Leland was mentioning in her wonderful introduction, I was named one of the top 18 history podcasts by the Oprah magazine before they premiered their final issue, of course. And that for the past 3 years running, PC Magazine has included me as one of their top 100 podcasts. And the last year we were listed in top as in one of their arts and culture podcasts. So it really has been an incredible labor of love for me that this has all come about because I still do my full-time job as an art curator at the North Carolina Museum of Art. But the biggest thing for me is that it's given me an opportunity to really expand my own personal knowledge about art and to share information about it outside of my curatorial job and with a whole new audience, many of whom are people who do already like art. I have a lot of artists themselves who really love to listen to the show, which is wonderful. But I have also had an equal amount of people come to me who say that they have had no experience and no interest in art, just like I did when I was growing up, and that having these stories to learn and share and listen to has made all the difference for them. And the biggest thing besides that has really come about in my life, besides the ArtCurious podcast, is the opportunity to write this book that officially came out to the public on September 15th of last year. And I was very grateful that I was able to put it out not only in the physical form of the book, but also was able to do the ebook, and I narrated the audiobook myself. So how it all came about was really almost 3 years ago when the podcast was bordering on being just a couple years old at that point. My husband sat me down and just very politely said, okay, now what? And I didn't really know what he was referring to because I thought, I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing. And then he said, you've got all this research that you've been doing, because every episode that I have done, I script out. So it's the equivalent of about 10 or 12 written pages that I narrate. And so it's akin to writing a term paper for an undergraduate course, basically, about every 2 or 3 weeks when I'm in season, which is a couple times a year. And so he said, you've got all this writing that you've done dozens of episodes, and that's great, but I think you should be doing more with them. And so it was actually he who floated the idea of writing a book. But I have to say that right off the back, the moment he broadened this topic with me, I was not interested at all. And to me, it seemed like a fairy tale, like an impossibility, like something that fancy people did. I always say it's like fancy things that happen in movies. Like I'm going to buy a chalet in the Alps. It seemed like just a story in and of itself. It didn't seem like something that a normal person like me could do. So I never have known somebody who's written a book outside of a museum publication, which I consider to be a slightly separate beast. And I didn't think it was something that I could ever do. So I have to admit that right off the back, I kind of balked and I said, thank you for thinking of me, but I am not going to do that. And then he very lovingly wore me down. And I tell people it was kind of like Groundhog Day, because he very lovingly and gently kept sitting down and saying, are you thinking about doing a book yet? And I would say, no, I am not thinking about doing a book. And then finally one day, I kind of got tired of hearing this. So I sat down and I took a number of months just to stare blankly at my computer screen. And I finally wrote a book proposal with the main goal of reiterating why stories about art are still important and have a really important place in our world, and how focusing more perhaps on the stranger or funnier sides of art might allow someone who is an art newbie or any kind of non-art person to find their footing in a world that may be entirely new or strange to them, and maybe in some cases can allow them to enter a world in which they felt like they've never really belonged before, like me when I was younger. And then if these stories can excite people along the way and transform them into museum goers or collectors or even burgeoning historians on their own, then all the better. So the goal for ArtCurious was always to be of interest to people who already love art, but to never alienate people who have had no interest or experience with that world. And I'm happy to say that Penguin Books was the first team to really agree that there was space in this world for these kind of stories. And so together I worked with their publishing team for a little less than 2 years to bring the project to completion. And that's including everything from the proposal acceptance to manuscript completion, and then finally to last September to the publication itself. So before we get on to our Q&A session, I just want to share with you 3 stories that if you haven't read the book already, that you can hopefully read about if and when you grab your copy of ArtCurious, Stories of the Unexpected, Slightly Odd, and Strangely Wonderful in Art History. So again, this will be a little bit of a retread perhaps to some of you who have read the book, but if you haven't, I am hopeful that this will give you a little taste of some of my favorite stories from the book, which you can read about in more detail for yourself. So again, here's a copy of the book. One of the first tales is about Vincent van Gogh, who I think is probably one of the most popular artists today, and certainly one of the most visited single artist museums in the world is the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam. And a lot of people are actually out there believing that Van Gogh, the person who we consider to be the epitome of this idea of the depressed, miserable artistic genius, didn't actually commit suicide, but that he could have been killed either accidentally or on purpose in July of 1890. So as we know, Van Gogh did suffer from mental illness, and he did have himself committed to a mental asylum in the year prior to his death. And at that time as well, he apparently had attempted to commit suicide. So to me, it never feels like a stretch to assume that he again did so in July of 1890. And it is noted that he went into a wheat field and he shot himself in the stomach before stumbling back to the inn where he was staying. And it was there that he lived another 2 days before succumbing to his injuries. And it was there that he noted to his doctor, Dr. Paul Gachet, and a few others, as well as the police, that it was he who indeed did injure himself. And he told them specifically, quote, "Do not blame anyone else," unquote. So it's a very odd statement many people have mentioned over the years. And it's an odd statement that was made even stranger over time, thanks to a number of kind of strange occurrences, like the disappearance of this particular gun that was supposedly used in the shooting, or the fact that Van Gogh's art equipment from that day, he was supposedly painting in the field as he did every day, had never been found. and the fact that several eyewitnesses mentioned that no one ever referred to this event as anything other than an accident. And then several apparent witnesses came forward to talk about Van Gogh's final days that highlighted the animosity that Vincent had felt during these times in his life, these last few days, especially when it came to this very rather poisonous relationship with, get this, a teenage boy with a Wild West obsession, a mean temperament, and possibly a malfunctioning rifle. So, very interesting tale and theory here. My second favorite story from ArtCurious involves this long-held debate about the world's first totally abstract painting, the world's first totally abstract artist. So in other words, the first painter to have created a completely abstract or non-representational work of art. So, art for art's sake, art not presenting, what a cow looks like, for example, or a bottle of wine or a portrait of a friend, but just could be something, a meditation on color, on tone and shape and so forth. And many historians have claimed that the Russian painter Vasily Kandinsky was the one to do this remarkable feat in and around 1911 with this painting that you can see partially on the screen here, which is called Composition from 1911. And even Kandinsky himself really tried to grab onto this title as he wrote to his art dealer a few years later, quote, "This painting, Composition, that you see here, is really the first totally abstract painting in the world, because in those days, there was no other artist who painted abstract pictures. Therefore, this is an historic painting," unquote. But one of the great things about art and art history is this continual reassessment for artists who have, for many different reasons, kind of fallen by the wayside. And mostly, as you can imagine, this really involves a lot of non-white male artists. So we're really looking to learn more about artists of color, women, and people of various gender and sexual identifications and so forth. And two women who have recently come back into the spotlight are really the British painter Georgiana Houghton, who you've seen here on the screen, and the Swedish painter Hilma af Klint, who has especially made it big in the last few years because there was a blockbuster exhibition, as many of you know, I'm sure, of her work a couple of years ago at the Guggenheim. And so both of these women were really, during their lifetimes, little known outside of local art circles within their own lands, but both created what many of us would call abstract art years, or in Georgiana's case, even a few decades before Vasily Kandinsky. And that's the fascinating thing in and of itself, that there's this story that allows us to reconsider the traditional ways that we tell stories about art history, especially a lot of those so-called firsts in art. And what's even more fascinating is that these women, very much independently of each other, they didn't know one another, and it doesn't look like they really knew much, if anything, about one another's work. Both of these women were also involved in the spiritualist movement of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And both of them independently claimed that there was some supernatural assistance at play in their works. So definitely read up on that one if you haven't already, because it's a very fun story that leads a lot of questions that I think can bring up a lot to debate about today. And finally, my third favorite tale that I'd like to share with you is this one. So I mentioned that I myself am a big podcast fan. And a few years ago, I was listening to an episode of the radio program This American Life on NPR. And I heard a story about a group of people who were working on this huge project, which was opening, cataloging, and preserving time capsules. And not just a few time capsules, but over 600 time capsules. And of course, I thought that sounded like the most amazing, random, fun, coolest job that anyone could possibly have, being a professional time capsule opener. But leading and learning a little bit more once the reporter told who these time capsules belonged to, because they all belonged to one particular person, I was floored, because this person was none other than Andy Warhol. And probably one of the biggest, if not the biggest name in 20th century art besides Pablo Picasso. And I was a little embarrassed to say that I didn't know anything up to that point about Andy Warhol having these time capsules. But we do know that Warhol was known to have been a very prolific collector who amassed really collections of everything from movie star memorabilia to very specific kinds of ceramics and dishware. And what you see on the screen here are some of his collectible cookie jars that he had. And when he died, there was this massive sale of his estate. And in the process of sorting through all of his goods to determine what could be sold and salvaged for this particular sale, this is a photograph of his living room when they were going through the process of categorizing everything for the sale. So you can see that it's just chock full of stuff. It was then discovered that there were all of these hundreds of cardboard boxes that Warhol himself had saved. Some of them were in his home, and some of them, hundreds of them really, were in a storage facility. And they were really actually archives of his life. Some of them were made in a particular moment in time, like a particular month of the year, like December 1976, for example, or a particular theme, like there's a box that housed only souvenirs of the flights that he took on the Concorde supersonic jet, for example. Now, the ones, I just want to show you some of them all spread out. This is one of his memorabilia boxes that had quite a few of his Hollywood items in it. And the one that you can see here on the screen on the right, for example, is his so-called Miss Piggy box for his time capsule for, I hopefully think, some various, obviously, reasons there. But what is so weird and wonderful about them is that he not only kept things that might seem important to you and me, so things like photos that he took of his friends, letters he received, or sketches or preparatory notes for works of art, of which there are many in the time capsules. But he also kept a whole bunch of things that I, for one, would definitely raise my eyebrows up about and would very much have me running for my dustbuster as well. So in particular, he had items in some time capsules like shoes belonging to Clark Gable, toenail clippings, junk mail, and even a piece of what was known to be noted as Caroline Kennedy's sweet 16th birthday cake. So I can imagine that that did not taste good, and that moldy food did not seem to be a rare part of these time capsules. He actually saved a number of food items in there. So when you get to the bottom of it, though, these capsules not only act like a large-scale archive or really a diary entry for the last couple of decades of his life, but we can also use the opportunity to look at these capsules as the chance to get into Andy Warhol's head. We can see the kind of things that inspired him, surrounded him, motivated him, or just really touched Andy Warhol's lives in some interesting way. And that could be very interesting for Andy Warhol. I apologize for the blurriness of this image, but when taken in conjunction with a lot of his paintings and prints especially, these time capsules really round out himself and his career, especially someone who was notoriously a little hard to get to know personally and really understand deep down. Someone who is very mysterious and really kept to himself. It opens him up in a way that otherwise would not have been possible. So all of this, I hope, has brought to you something that shows you how these non-traditional tales of art and educational yet entertaining look at art can bring in art history to life in a new way for all of us. And I always say that if people learn things along the way while they're reading the book or listening to the podcast, that's my favorite thing. But that's gravy. Most of all, I just want you to listen and be entertained. So I want to thank each and every one of you for being here with me today. It's been so much fun to share the story of how this podcast and this book came about. And I would be thrilled to turn it over to you for any questions that you may have or answer any other thoughts that you have. And I'd be thrilled to answer. So thank you.
Jennifer, thank you so much. That was great. I, for one, am very excited to listen to your podcast. I haven't had a chance to yet, but I know Natasha has. And she raves about it. So I'm very excited. And it looks like we do have a few questions. Let me just scroll up here. From Elsa. She says, please purchase the book so you can keep it as a research book. I underlined many articles and researched more on the internet.
Thank you.
She says, found chapter 3 about Walter Sickert very interesting, and using the internet, Googled Patricia Cornwell and Sickert. Did you get in touch with Patricia?
I did not. I really wanted to keep this more of, that's a great question, more of not a takedown necessarily of Patricia Cornwell's theory, but I wanted to look at her own very strong feelings about Sickert being Jack the Ripper and compare it to what we know of the crime scene in particular, and talk about it a little bit from an art historical perspective. Part of that was also because I feel it's my responsibility to say that a lot of us as viewers, and certainly historians as well, you know, the meaning of a work of art is really in the eye of the beholder. And so we see things that might not necessarily be true, or they might, but we might be more akin to seeing things like potential murder scene themes in Walter Sickert's work that might not necessarily actually be his intention. So ultimately, I really can't say that Walter Sickert was Jack the Ripper. I am probably more on the side of skepticism than not. But I've got to say, you know, I always say until a better suspect that has more concrete connections comes to light, it doesn't hurt to keep a very kind of cynical eye on Sickert.
All right, great. We have another question here from Merle. Is there any artist that you are most curious about that you can't find info on?
Ooh, that's a really good question. I would say that in the last couple of years, I've definitely been trying to expand the podcast in particular towards doing more with artists who may not normally be your bigger household names. I would say the hardest one that I've been trying to find more details on, I did a podcast episode earlier this spring or summer, I can't quite remember which one, on Katsushika Oe, who's a Japanese painter and printmaker whose father was Hokusai. So if you're knowing Japanese printmaking from the 19th century, the Edo period, if you know the image of that great wave crashing with Mount Fuji in the distance, that's Hokusai. And it turns out that in the last few years, the last really couple decades of his life, he was really expanding the idea of Hokusai and stepped back in retirement. And his daughter, one of his multiple children, his daughter Katsushika Oe, really jumped in and really became Hokusai for all intents and purposes, and then also became a known artist in her own right. But there's not a lot of details really about her. There's just like the scantest information. And so I've really just been able to dig up only a handful of details about her, and I would love to know more. But as you can imagine, like a late 19th century woman artist working in Japan, who's really in many ways hiding some of her own pieces under her own father's name, it's hard to find a lot on her. But hopefully there will be other historians, hopefully in Japan especially, who can start digging up more details. That's a great question, Merle.
All right, wonderful. I'm not seeing anything yet, but if you want to take a few seconds to enter any questions into the chat or the Q&A, please do so. Just in the meantime, I will let you all know that coming up in February, we have our annual meeting, which of course, as most of you know, is usually on site in the museum, but this year it will be virtual. It is on February 17th. At 4 p.m. and you can go to our website for more details on that and to sign up. But in the meantime, if there are any more questions, please let us know. I see here from Natalie, she does say, she has a comment, check out Beyond the Visible, documentary of Hilma at Clint. Amazing.
I haven't seen that one yet, so that's going to go at the top of my list. I feel like there's always such amazing art docs out there to see. Good point. Great. Any other questions I can answer today?
Sometimes, let's see. Well, it looks like that might be it. So Jennifer, thank you so much. And of course, if anyone does have any questions, you can always email us and we can pass it along to Jennifer.
Please don't be shy.
Also said we had the Norman Rockwell painting at the museum.
The
museum.
Murder in Mississippi painting, I'm assuming you're talking about. That was one of my favorite chapters in the book to write. So that one was really incredible. It's a fascinating painting, and the stories behind a lot of Rockwell's works in the 60s, I think, are really surprising, very interesting. And before we go, I just want to say that, yes, please do not hesitate to be in touch with Leland or Natasha or myself directly. I'm always happy to talk art with anyone and everyone, so it's never a bother to reach out. And please listen to the podcast if you get a chance.
Yeah, I'm very excited. And
Thank you.
Heather, one of our members, Heather, says, can't wait to read your book. So
thank you. Thank you. Means the world to me to have support for the book and the podcast. It really does. Thank you all.
And if anyone is new to podcasts, I'm happy to give anyone a little tutorial if you need it. So feel free to reach out to me or to Leland if you want to get going on that. Of course, I highly recommend ArtCurious, but also many other podcasts that I love. So we're happy to do that.
yeah,
and I don't make it
absolutely.
easy on people in the fact that ArtCurious is one word. So if you Google art space curious, or if you're looking it up in your search app on your podcast app, it doesn't come up easily that way. So ArtCurious, one word. I know, I make things hard for no reason.
That's great. Jennifer, thank you so much. This was amazing.
Thank you all. I
We
really
hope to have you
appreciate
back for another program soon.
it. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it.
And thank you to all of our members for joining us today and for your support. And thank you, Natasha, and have a great day, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.